Você já ouviu falar de Mirabelli? A gente vive num mundo com bases bem sólidas no tudo que é material, não é? Comércio, indústria, as relações, tudo bem fundamentado no que é físico. Agora imagine quando você nasce num mundo desse e começa a viver uma vida entre dois mundos muito diferentes. Um mundo em que o que acontece com você é, para uns, uma exceção, para outros, ridículo e outros, simplesmente pura mentira. Que as pessoas não acreditam no que você é e nem no que você vive. Esse é o drama de muitos médiums autênticos nessa terra. Então a gente traz para você aqui novamente um documento do Keith Parsons sobre esse médium extraordinário de efeitos físicos, Carlos Mirabelli. Keith traz nessa análise tudo que os estrangeiros viram aqui e perceberam sobre o que o médium era, olhar das academias internacionais sobre o que acontecia aqui, olhar não poucas vezes manchado pelo ceticismo dogmático. É que principalmente no seu início a chamada parapsicologia era composta de muitos cientistas que eram simplesmente negadores do extrafísico, não é? Dogmáticos, não importando o nível de evidência a que fossem submetidos. Hoje esses esquemas flagrantes de negação dogmática já estão bem escaneados e definidos pelos atuais pesquisadores do assunto, e a negação tem também experimentado hoje o seu ridículo. Antes de julgarmos quaisquer médiums, coloquemos-nos no lugar de uma pessoa como Mirabelli, que era um homem como qualquer um de nós, com seus desejos humanos, suas qualidades e fraquezas. Com a diferença de viver entre dois mundos muito diferentes um do outro. Não é nada fácil. Por isso, cremos que o critério kardeciano seja muito bom, excelente e essencial para que o médium consiga sofrer menos, se enganar menos, independentemente da religião ou credo a que esse médium possa pertencer. Lembrando que a obra de Kardec não é a fundação de uma nova religião, como ele mesmo disse, mas um tratado sobre o uso ético e civilizado, por exemplo, da mediunidade, para o bem maior da humanidade. Kardec dizia se orgulhar de ter em torno de sua mesa pessoas das mais diversas religiões, católicos, protestantes, judeus, brahmanes. Bem, gente, por mais defeitos e qualidades que um médium possa ter, a mensagem primordial que todos passam é a mesma que Jesus trouxe quando se materializou na frente de seus discípulos. A mensagem primordial, que é a vida após a morte, o fundamento de toda a doutrina de amor e de verdade na Terra. E isso nós devemos a esses sofridos e muitas vezes mal compreendidos médiuns. Espero que gostem.
Spirit Connections.
I've decided to start this video with a famous fairy tale phrase, not least because on this occasion it offers you a challenge. Am I, or am I not telling you, a fairy tale? Well, that's for you to judge. Anyway, here goes. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in 1889 to be precise, there lived an Italian Lutheran pastor. This pastor's name in Italian was Luigi Mirabelli, and this is an old photograph of him. For an Italian, being a Protestant was unusual, since most Italians are Roman Catholic. He had emigrated from Italy and now resided in a medium-sized inland town in Brazil, 140 miles west of São Paulo. Today, Botucatu, with a population of around 130,000, is bigger than when this story begins. 1889 was the year that Luigi Mirabelli's wife bore him a son. They called him Carmine, or Carlos Mirabelli, and this photograph shows where he was born, in Rua Amando de Barros. Carlos grew up to be a short, thick-set man, and if the facts about him are correct, then these photographs of Carlos Mirabelli are portraits of possibly the greatest medium of all time. For many people, his psychic phenomena have never been surpassed, anywhere or at any time. The trouble is, his achievements appeared so remarkable that some people refused to accept them as genuine. And this despite Mirabelli's voluntarily submitting to a great deal of testing by eminent scientists in broad daylight or bright electric light instead of the usual darkness under which physical phenomena occur. Botucatu was a deeply Christian community when Carlos was growing up, with religious life centred around the cathedral and other churches. Despite his Protestant background, Carlos had the ambition to become a Roman Catholic priest. But as a youngster with only a rudimentary education, this religious ambition was frustrated. Instead, he started work in a shoe shop, where his fellow workers thought him creepy. They were unnerved by his piercing light blue eyes, and some saw him as arrogant and conceited. Worst of all was the poltergeist activity he attracted. When Mirabelli was in the shop, shoeboxes reputedly leapt off the shelves and would fly around, even following him out into the street occasionally. So it's not surprising that he was committed to the local insane asylum for 9 days of observation. Once there, he demonstrated to the resident physician his ability to move objects without touching them. And then, before a group of doctors, under test conditions, Mirabelli apparently teleported a painting several miles from one house to another. When the Brazilian press heard about this, it launched him on a spectacular career. His mediumship and trances made him famous. Not many commentators mention Mirabelli's life outside of his mediumship. From their reports, you'd think it was all he did. Yet despite his modest education, he made money as a businessman, travelling to Europe, the United States and Africa. Some of his business dealings failed, but he succeeded sufficiently to be able to lead a comfortable life. Amongst other things, he was a representative for numerous pharmaceutical companies. Mirabelli was married 4 times and had 4 children by 3 of these wives. As a smoker of cigars and pipes, he was not always in good health. He suffered from diabetes, but his death was not related to these. For many years he could only sleep in illuminated rooms, since he was afraid of unpleasant phenomena while he slept. He's reputed to have been able to sing in 3 voices, tenor, baritone and bass, and able to play the guitar, the violin, the piano and the flute without ever having music lessons. Many times the instruments are said to have played by themselves without manual contact. There are other instances of this in the literature. He could also draw and paint with ease, but never had art lessons. He produced paranormal lights and odours, and he claimed to see and hear the deceased. It's not surprising that he was a temperamental character. One of his abilities was said to be xenoglossy, speaking in foreign languages unknown to him in his normal waking state. The books on xenoglossy acknowledge that it's a rarity. In Mirabelli's case, not just a few languages either, but 28. Once in trance, he would give lectures on politics, philosophy, astronomy, sociology, history and medicine. And these talks were given in German, French and Dutch, in English, Greek and Polish, in Albanian, Czech and Italian dialects, also in Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew, Chinese, Japanese and more, plus Latin and ancient Greek. And that's without counting the native tongue of Brazil, Portuguese. Having said that, Guy Lyon Playfair, a British researcher who lived in Brazil, remarked, "All the witnesses I interviewed agreed that Mirabelli could not even speak either Italian or Portuguese correctly." In 1919, Brazil's Academy for Psychic Studies was formed in São Paulo, named after the renowned Italian psychical researcher Professor Cesar Lombroso. In his day, Lombroso was influential in both Europe and Brazil as a criminologist, as well as having been professor of psychiatry at Turin University. The Academy's organisers held 392 sittings with Mirabelli. Of these, 189 were for spoken mediumship, all were positive, 93 for automatic writing, of which 8 were negative, and 110 for physical phenomena, of which 47 were negative. So 63 sessions were positive for physical phenomena. In these tests, Mirabelli was tied up in a chair and the rooms were searched before and afterwards, with no chance for the medium to cheat in the dark. A total of 555 witnesses took part, including medical doctors, scientists and engineers. Subsequently, when British researchers realised that Mirabelli himself was a founder of this academy, they became suspicious of it. Whether they thought that over 500 reputable people were also in collusion with the medium is not so clear. This photograph shows a session at the Cesar Lombroso Academy, with the lights on and both of the medium's hands controlled by the sitters and physicians. This photo shows the medium being examined by the renowned physicians Dr. Carlos Niemeyer, Dr. Allegretti Figlio, the Baron of Ergonti, a well-known psychic investigator, and with Dr. Silvio Campos, an attorney, and Dr. J. Motta, director of the São Paulo Journal. These were the kind of investigators he was attracting. While in trance, Mirabelli's automatic writing showed great erudition. He wrote at great speed without looking at his paper, and his eyes remained directed upwards towards a distant point. It said that once in trance he could write with both hands simultaneously, producing 2 texts in different languages. Here are some examples of his scripts in different languages. It said that he could not emulate the speed of his writing in his normal waking state, and the experts were deeply impressed. Mirabelli could also be levitated by psychic forces. This photograph is his most famous one, and it's mired in controversy, and I'll refer to it later. Witnesses also saw heavy furniture levitated, and cars lifted 2 meters off the ground for several minutes at a time. When not being investigated, Mirabelli used his powers for healing the sick, and he was arrested 15 times for practicing medicine without qualifications. He could also produce music. In a demonstration before 1,000 people, he made drums beat and trumpets play a march. Bottles and glasses would clink together in harmony, and he caused a violin to hover in the air, being played by a pair of materialized spirit hands. Afterwards, a group of physicians signed a testimony, a deposition, declaring the truth of these events. His most sensational accomplishment was the physical materialization of spirits of the dead. This photo shows the third occasion that Mirabelli produced a materialized spirit, a complete one, with the medium in trance and under absolute control. This photo shows the materialization in full light of the poet Giuseppe Parini, who died in 1799. Mirabelli is on the left, Dr. Carlos de Castro is on the right, with the materialized spirit in the centre, and he looks like a normal human being. In one séance, the room began smelling of roses, and a golden mist formed, and then a bishop in his full regalia emerged from the mist. He was identified as Bishop Dr. José de Camargo Barros, who had recently died in a shipwreck. He gave his name, and a doctor inspected his body and eyes, touched his teeth, tested his saliva and heartbeat, and declared him to be anatomically complete. Before the bishop dematerialized, he bent over the entranced Mirabelli, who remained slumped in his chair as though dead. The bishop then requested the onlookers to watch him dematerialize. Was this a miracle, a trick, or just a fairy tale? But there's much more with supporting photographic evidence. For example, for 36 minutes in broad daylight, the young daughter of a Dr. de Souza, who had recently died of influenza, materialized and was visible to all the sitters. Appearing in her burial clothes, her pulse was tested. Father and child spoke with each other and were photographed together, and then the little girl floated into the air and disappeared. During this time, Mirabelli was secured to his chair in trance. The witnesses included 20 medical doctors and 7 professors. I have seen the photographs relating to this, but unfortunately I can't find them at the moment. They're very rare. But not everyone accepted Mirabelli's feats at face value. A magician imitated some of them, and a heated debate followed, resulting in the President of Brazil himself instituting in 1927 an arbitration board to look into Mirabelli's phenomena. This photograph shows Mirabelli with the President. The investigative team consisted of the President himself, with a Dr. Brandt of the Institute of Technology, and 18 other learned men of Brazil. Incidentally, Wikipedia makes no mention of this investigation in its report on the man. Then again, in 1928, Dr. Hans Driesch, a German professor and former president of the British Society for Psychical Research, threw cold water on these marvels after his own investigation of Mirabelli. He saw no materializations, no transportations, and heard only two languages used, Estonian and Italian. But he did see the movement of a small vase and the opening of some folding doors without any visible cause. He doubted that the book entitled O Medium Mirabelli, relating to the medium's marvels, was written by anyone other than Mirabelli himself. Maybe he should have asked Mirabelli about that. Perhaps Professor Driesch overlooked that in 1927, the very year that he was president of the SPR, the Journal of the Society specifically referred to Rodolfo Mikuláš as the editor and publisher of that book. But let's look again at some of the wondrous aspects of Mirabelli. On one occasion, after the materialized figure of a Dr. de Menezes had been found to be anatomically perfect, his body began to dissolve from the feet upwards, leaving a torso and arms floating in the air. So another doctor rushed forward and seized it. Uttering a cry, he sank to the floor unconscious. Apparently he'd received a kind of electric shock, and on recovering, declared that having had this opportunity to feel the spirit's dissolving body, it had turned into a spongy, flaccid mass. On another occasion, some observers, including the physicians Dr. Carlos Pereira de Castro and Dr. Olegario de Moura, were sitting around a table when a loud blast was heard coming from above. The ceiling was over 3 meters high. Mirabelli was in a trance state, and suddenly a man with the looks of an Arab appeared, standing over the table, despite the room being locked. The very solid apparition descended from the table and sat among the sitters. Dr. Olegario did a clinical examination for 30 minutes and concluded that the entity was a normal human being. The figure was touched by everyone present, and speaking in Arabic, the man introduced himself as Harun al-Rashid. Later, he returned to the tabletop, spoke a little more Arabic, and then levitated for 10 or 12 seconds before vanishing in a flash. And finally, I'll mention a Hindu figure that materialized 4 meters up in the air in a garden during an open-air séance, and then slowly descended to earth. Here are 2 of the 3 pictures taken of him. In 1930, Dr. Eric Dingwall, a British psychical researcher, got to examine the original Portuguese documents on Mirabelli, and he emphasized in the Journal of the American SPR their enormous importance. He noted that Carlos submitted himself to the severest test of his investigators, being tied and stripped until doubt of the genuineness of these phenomena was excluded. He agreed they were so extraordinary there was nothing like them in the whole range of psychical literature, and while he considered it tempting to condemn Mirabelli as a monstrous fraud, he rejected the idea, since human beings born on this earth, and I quote, do not usually rise up into the air, float about and dissolve. In May 1934, an American, Miss May Walker, had sittings with Mirabelli and thought some of his phenomena were genuine and some suspect. But the worst damage wrought on Mirabelli came from Theodore Besterman, the investigating officer of the British Society for Psychical Research. His report in the Society's Journal of December 1935 followed 5 formal sittings with Mirabelli and various informal ones. He alleged the following. Firstly, Mirabelli demanded and obtained more substantial fees than ever asked elsewhere for sittings at a medium's own premises. Secondly, he alleged that Mirabelli and the Cesar Lombroso Psychical Academy were one and the same entity, with the official records of seances dictated by the medium himself. Thirdly, with up to 20 sitters arranged as an audience, no control was exercised, suggested or even asked for by any sitter other than Besterman himself, and then without success. Fourthly, he said Mirabelli was so accustomed to a reverential audience that his procedures were crude in the extreme. This related to a coin vanishing trick, the appearance of apports, and making bottles clink to order. He also alleged it was likely that Mirabelli's wife was an accomplice. Besterman found several sitters who also doubted his authenticity. Fifthly, communicators through automatic writing, such as Cromwell, Sir Isaac Newton, and Sir William Crookes, appeared to write not in their own language. For example, Crookes wrote, "Anybody amongst you shall certainly be surprised at hearing me in a tongue that during all my life were foreign to me. But you must undoubtedly know that we, abiding in the kingdom of the Spirit, must have faculties that till now have been unknown by all the men on earth." Besterman also questioned whether Mirabelli could write in numerous languages without having some knowledge of them, and he credits Mirabelli with a good education rather than a rudimentary one. Finally, Besterman asserted that time and again efforts were made to induce Mirabelli to come to Europe for testing, but without success, due to the impossible terms and conditions laid down by Mirabelli, which would have rendered the resulting sittings the merest formalities. So, how much of this is true? For a view on Mirabelli, I consulted Wendy Zammit, who recently gave an address on Mirabelli at an international conference on afterlife evidence.
I wouldn't take anything that Theodore Besterman said. Remember, he was a professional skeptic. He was very skeptical about psychic phenomena. In 1929, he conducted a whole lot of tests with cards on mental mediumship, and he declared that there's no such thing as clairvoyance. He went to Brazil on a 2-week trip. He signed things in Brazil that happened which he omitted from his report. He didn't interview anybody while he was there. He didn't speak Portuguese. And so, honestly, his report is quite worthless.
One additional comment is due here. When Besterman was in Brazil, he's said to have recognised the materialisation of a woman and a former friend of his, known as Zabel. Here is her photograph. But he excluded this information in his report to the SPR, as though he were trying to suppress evidence. Also, during the so-called coin tricks that he rejected as legitimate, a coin was seen to levitate from the hand of a Mrs. Olga, with a Dr. Alvaro stating that he saw a coin travel through the air which ended up in a rear pocket of a Mr. Fry. Interestingly, Besterman signed off as accurate the records of that séance at the end of the sitting. Despite Besterman's claim that Mirabelli avoided coming to Europe for tests, he had in fact already proven himself willing to venture abroad. In 1930, 4 years before Besterman's visit to Brazil, he went to New York and took part in 2 little-known sittings, showing that he did accept invitations, even from sceptical foreign academics. According to the report, Mirabelli was invited by a group of university professors, including several physicians, to hold a controlled séance in full light at the Institute for Chemistry. Once in trance, a blurred, smoke-like column of about 1 metre high formed in the middle of the room, a few metres away from the medium. Out of this nebulous mass, a single, very white arm formed, the arm of a woman. One finger wore a ring, which suddenly fell from the finger and rolled underneath a small table. Immediately afterwards, the arm began to dissolve and disappear. The whole phenomenon took 6 minutes and was photographed by 2 cameras. Upon inspection, the ring turned out to be a gold wedding ring with the inscription J. Irving on its inside, and one of the sitters was an industrialist named John Irving, who had lost his young wife 3 years ago in a car accident, just 2 years after they married. Irving claimed the wedding ring his wife was buried with was identical to the ring that fell from the finger of the materialized arm. The report states that this sitting left a deep impression on all present, even the skeptics. Well, it would, wouldn't it? Another phenomenon I must mention was Mirabelli's teleportation. On one occasion, he was reported to have been teleported around 50 miles in 2 minutes from a railway station platform to his destination, with witnesses testifying in his favour. On another occasion, he dematerialised from a séance room while still tied to his chair and with the doors and windows sealed. He travelled to another room in the same building. Some sitters remained in the séance room while others went searching for him, and on finding him, the seals on his bonds were still untouched. I appreciate that this seems beyond belief, but teleportation exists elsewhere in the literature, so you might want to look into it. But getting back to the criticisms of Mirabelli, one aspect of Theodore Besterman's report of 1935 criticised Dingwall's conclusions of 1930. So Dingwall responded somewhat bitterly. He argued, had Besterman received precise instructions on what to find out in Brazil, he might have produced something of value instead of bringing back stories of silly tricks. And he criticised Besterman for failing to interview even one of the serious researchers named in the documents that he himself had reviewed. Nor did Besterman interview any of the sitters recorded as present at the alleged materializations of either Bishop Barros or Dr. de Souza's daughter. "40 years after Mirabelli's death in 1990, a photograph was found in the Society for Psychical Research archives. It showed Mirabelli in a white lab coat levitating to a height of several feet, as you see here, and it was inscribed on the back by Mirabelli to Besterman from his visit in 1934. It was claimed that the photograph showed signs of careful retouching to eliminate the ladder supporting Mirabelli, and this close-up photograph from the BBC supports that idea. If so, this was the first evidence of intentional trickery ever discovered by this extraordinary medium. So what was Mirabelli like as a person? Well, Besterman described him as genial, temperamental, dynamic, yet unreliable. And fellow spiritists in Brazil had reservations about him, partly because he had taken money for some of his seances, but also because things tended to get smashed up when he was around. Nor did his family appreciate cutlery sent flying across the room by unseen hands, or having furniture unexpectedly piled on top of them. So his wife and the children lived apart from Mirabelli. But also he was a generous man. Although he'd been paid for at least some of his seances, he often gave this money away. He was kind-hearted and helped found the San Luis House of Charity for people in need. He liked animals and opera, and led a bohemian lifestyle. Being profligate, he would buy, say, 10 suits or a dozen pairs of shoes at one time, only to give most of them away. Besterman thought there were only 2 possible conclusions about this man, that Mirabelli was an out-and-out fraud, but in this case it must have involved dozens of confederates who impersonated false apparitions in full light, from little children to old men and women, from all levels of social standing, and it must have required numerous deceitful investigators to collude with the process over several decades. The second alternative, Besterman says, is what he called a narrowly defined paranormal ability existed, around which Mirabelli erected for commercial purposes an elaborate structure of fraud. The alternative explanation, which Besterman did not put forward, was that Mirabelli was, without question, one of the most spectacular mediums in history, regardless of whether or not he resorted to fraud on occasion. Certainly, Mirabelli would not be the first genuine medium who nevertheless cheated from time to time. Some of his witness phenomena are without parallel, and one thing we're certain of, he was one of the most tantalizing yet frustrating characters in the whole history of psychical research. As the researcher Guy Lyon Playfair put it, Mirabelli was surely the medium to end all mediums. You name it, and he is said to have done it. So there's the end of this fairy tale. There's just one footnote. As Mirabelli aged, his psychic gifts did not deteriorate, with reports of his phenomena up to a few months before he died. On Monday, April the 30th, 1951, he was taking his son to the cinema and decided to cross the road to buy him an ice cream, leaving his son behind to chat with a shoeshine boy. As his son remembered it, suddenly a black 1938 Ford turned the corner and ran his father over, leaving him in a coma. Mirabelli had sustained a fractured skull, and he died in hospital without gaining consciousness. It was a shocking end to an extraordinary career. Thanks for listening.